Thank you. Well, thanks for coming in to talk
Not at
about
all,
your
not
book.
at all.
Tell me, what sparked your love for literature? Where did
Well, it's
that...
always been a natural interest. I've always read books right from an early age, immersed myself in books. And books for me are so important because they can change the whole way you feel and see about life. A good book can actually change you. So it's always been a natural interest. I've always read. And of course, having a Christian faith, I'm particularly interested in books which show some kind of wrestling with the Christian faith. And that has always been so ever since I first sort of read Dostoevsky many years ago. And I'm interested in the underlying kind of perspective on existence which comes through books. I mean, when I was a teenager, I read all Hardy, and you got this sort of very gloomy view of life with the fates against you. So I'm interested in that.
The range of authors that you've chosen,
Yes.
Are those the ones that have had most impact on you, or is it simply the lessons that we can draw from them?
I think that they're the ones that I'm naturally interested in. I've always been very interested in Dostoevsky. Always been a huge fan of William Golding, for example. In recent years, with Marilyn Robinson, still am a huge fan of Marilyn Robinson, and I'm a huge fan of Eliot, of Auden, and one of the greatest writers of the 20th century is Samuel Beckett, and I absolutely love his plays. Not everybody knows that, for instance, Waiting for Godot is steeped in religious imagery. He didn't have an explicit Christian faith himself, but it's very fascinating the way he draws on Christian imagery, sometimes in a way to subvert it.
I mean, some of those authors that you cover have come from a religious background, but others have been atheists.
That's right. Obviously, it's too easy to call Beckett an atheist. There's a friend of mine called Francis Warner, a very distinguished poet and English scholar, who knew Beckett well as a young man, and he said to me once, Beckett is a Christ-haunted man, a secular mystic. And that, of course, is where the title comes from, Haunted by Christ. And in my chapter on Beckett, I show that he had a kind of godless mysticism, which is not the Christian faith, but it's very interesting. It's not just simply a straightforward atheism. Now, another person who rejected the Christian faith but was hugely attracted to it was Stevie Smith. She loved the Christian faith. She was bowled over of it. She was in love with it. But she felt the moral necessity to reject it because of Christians' teaching about hell. So one of the themes that's in this book is hell, because T.S. Eliot actually thought it very important to believe in hell. I mean, he knew hell in his own life, and he thought hell was a reality. And the other non-believer whom I consider in a chapter with C.S. Lewis is Philip Pullman. Now, this is again another interesting form of skepticism, because he has a moral objection to the Christian faith, and he dislikes C.S. Lewis's writings on moral grounds. So I have a chapter contrasting Lewis and Pullman, both wonderful storytellers, and showing how, in the end, how they have very differing views of what it is to be a mature human being.
Now, Pullman's an interesting case in point there. There's a quote that he once said. He said, if there is a God, and he is as the Christians describe him, then he deserves to be put down and rebelled against. So that's not so much being haunted by Christ.
Well, he's certainly, it's got under his skin. It's got under his skin in a major way, stirs him up. And it's very important, I think, for Christians to take that moral argument very, very seriously. We've got to, it's quite strongly around these days, and we've got to look at it and see what validity there is in it. But Philip Pullman also said that all novels, all writing should have what he called a moral clout. He's a profoundly moral writer, and that's an important thing for Christians to reckon with.
I mean, he's almost taking the opposite view to C.S. Lewis's point about Jesus the man and
yes,
Jesus the Christ.
That's
Pullman
right.
could accept the man,
yeah,
but not.
That's right.
Not the Messiah.
Exactly. But I make it clear this book is not just about Christians, it's about modern writers who wrestle with the Christian faith. The most of them are Christians, and they're the famous people like Eliot. I have a chapter on Eliot in which I pose 3 questions. What did he convert from? Why did he convert? And what did he convert to? And what difference it made to his life? Because there's now fascinating material in his letters over that period of his conversion. And we can see, what it was that changed, why he changed it, and what difference it made to his life.
There's an interesting one that you cover, Shusaka Endo, and he seemed to make an interesting. People have said about his work that writing as a Japanese Christian, he's very much on the outside.
Yes.
Does being on the outside give us a different insight into God?
Well, I think that in our present very secular society at the moment, all Christians are on the outside, actually. In terms of the prevailing zeitgeist, the prevailing intellectual zeitgeist, dominated by the media, of course, it's a very secular media, so I think anybody who takes the Christian faith seriously does, in a sense, feel like outside that, you know better than I do how difficult it is to make any kind of inroads or impact into that intellectual zeitgeist of our time. But there's a particular problem with Endo and Japanese culture, because the dominant image in Endo's novels is Japan as a marsh. Everything loses its distinctive nature and gets dissolved. So you try to say there's something distinctive about Christ, and somehow it all gets submerged in this swamp, taken in this swamp. That's a very interesting, different challenge, looking at another culture like that. Yes, that Endo appears in a chapter I have on grace in failure, considering 4 Roman Catholic novelists, Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Shusako Endo, and Flannery O'Connor, because grace is one of the themes that runs through the book, and that tries to bring out all the different kinds of failure. This grace can be seen even in failures, and in Endo's case, the failure of the Christian mission to Japan in the 17th century.
I'm talking about Beckett there. He had a very bleak outlook on life. And
very bleak indeed, but also deeply moving, extraordinarily powerful. I've been privileged to see some of the great performances of Beckett's plays over the years, and they are shattering in the way they bring through the bleakness of human existence, but also the poignancy of it. So
waiting for Godot.
Waiting for Godot. He always insisted that it wasn't waiting for God. For him, in that play, life is a kind of confused waiting for we know not what, and it is wonderfully done.
Yeah, there's Stevie Smith. There's a quote saying, "There is a God in whom I do not believe, yet to this God my love stretches."
Yes, that's right.
Do you think that was an experience?
I think unfortunately it's too rare these days, because she knew what the Christian faith was. She was hugely attracted by it. She couldn't think of anything more wonderful or lovely than the Christian faith. But as I said, she felt she had to reject it on moral grounds because of its teaching on hell. But unfortunately today, too few people have that kind of sense. Somehow, as a church, we've not been able to open up people's minds and imaginations to feel the full force of the attraction of this. This is one of the great challenges, I think, of our culture at the moment. And I suppose, as a writer from a Christian point of view, overall, what I like to do is try to prise people's minds open to see the possibility of Christian truth, and then to open up their imagination to see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. It's a question of opening people's minds and imagination. And I think the importance of novels and poetry is actually they can do that in a way that so much Christian communication can't do. It can open up people's minds and imagination. They may not believe, but at least they can see the full force of what is being offered.
And poetry has a way of doing that perhaps
Yes, I think
prose doesn't?
no, I wouldn't say that. I think I think poetry has a capacity for encapsulating sometimes just in a few words some very sharp new insight. I mean, so much of our language, of course, is the sort of sludge, linguistic sludge of our society, endlessly recycle cliches, and the good poets, of course, get beyond that and give us a sort of freshness. As Eliot put in one of his lines, poet's job is to purify the dialect of the tribe. So that's one of the things about poetry, I think, and I've got discussions of Auden, I think, who does it in a wonderful way, and of course so does Eliot, and for many people, Emily Dickinson, who's usually regarded as America's best poet now. Emily Dickinson had an extraordinary, intense experience of God, very deep. It was totally overwhelmed her. She had an ambivalent relationship with her local church. She was rather sort of a bit laughy about it. It didn't seem to be to her sort of as serious as this sort of experience she had. And that's all in her poetry.
Yeah. One of the writers that you cover was George Mackay-Brown.
And Edwin Muir.
Yes.
Yes.
But for Mackay-Brown, it took 25 years to think about his religious beliefs before he actually became a Christian.
Yes, yes. Well, those are two remarkable writers, all from the Orkneys. That chapter is called Light from the Orkneys. And Mackay-Brown was right. Unfortunately, he discovered beer, and he had a drinking problem which he struggled to overcome. But he writes about the sort of hardship of life in the Orkneys, but somehow grace coming through it. And Edwin Muir I think, is particularly important because George Mackay-Brown, in fact, moved from really no serious religious background to becoming a serious Roman Catholic. Edwin Muir, of course, was brought up, with a sort of fairly dour Scottish Protestantism, and he lost his faith totally when he moved to Glasgow. Not only faith in any kind of God, but faith in human beings. It was one of the devastating moment for him when he was in a tram one day. He looked at the fellow passengers and he just thought, well, these are just animals on the way to the slaughterhouse. It absolutely devastated him. And his life is a pilgrimage of, first of all, trying to recover the sense of the immortal in human beings, something special and immortal about human beings. And then when he was in Rome and he saw the sort of little plaques on the walls of Mary and Jesus and so on, suddenly began to discover a more sacramental form of Christianity, and he contrasts it with the service of the Word which he'd heard as a child, with this religion which he began to discover. This is the Word made flesh, actually here amongst us. So that was a very interesting pilgrimage, and particularly important, I think, is Edwin Muir on the whole question of suffering. He's got one poem called One Foot in Eden, contrasting sort of life in paradise with life as it is now, with some wonderful lines in it. What had Eden ever to say of faith and hope and pity and love? From these beclouded skies, fall blessings that Eden never knew. It's wonderful, wonderful lines. Not in any way diminishing the experience of suffering, which he knew in his own life a lot of, knew a lot of depression, but knew that somehow this life, for all its anguish, reveals these wonderful things that we prize so much, like faith and hope and pity and love.
I suppose many of these writers are asking the questions that nearly everybody asks.
Yes.
What's the meaning of that? Searching for perhaps the supernatural, the numinous.
Yes, yeah. Indeed. Indeed. I mean, there are questions which certainly any thoughtful human being ought to be asking. And if there's something rather odd, if sometimes in their life they stutter, Kennedy, the famous World War champion, put it in one of his sermons, or more than one sermon, and they thought, it comes in every man's life. The time when he wonders what the heck it's all about, that's so. And I think these novelists and poets can give some kind of inkling in an extraordinarily powerful, imaginative way, which I think will. Anyway, I'm hoping that it'll be quite. I think it'll be of quite. I believe it'll be quite wide interest because of the bringing together religion and literature in this way. Because for many people today, literature is where actually they look for the meaning of life, isn't it? The prestige given to literature in our society now. So I'm hoping that this book will link in with that.
I think you see in the quote is that in works of literature we can begin to discover what the Christian faith is about and what is at stake. What do you mean by at stake?
Well, I think what it entails, this comes across very strongly for me, I think, in that novel of Shusaku Endo, where this Christian mission to Japan in the 17th century is virtually totally obliterated. But there's one strange figure who was ministering to the Indians, who retains a Christian faith and believes that Jesus is still with him through thick and through thin. And a sort of haunting line that goes with the samurai as they go back to Japan to face their death, he will be with you all the time. But I think that all those novels bring out that Christian faith isn't about success in an ordinary kind of sense, and it might absolutely glisten most radiantly, when everything seems to be failure.
Many of the writers that you reflect on in the book come from a Roman Catholic background. Do you think there's a different sort of formation from a Roman Catholic upbringing to atheist or any other religion?
Well, I think there are very different forms of atheism. People can be, depending on how they were formed. A Roman Catholic atheist would be very different, I think, later on from a Protestant atheist later on, because of their whole kind of formation. I think, Marilyn Robinson is a Protestant, and her plea is that we've forgotten the great Reformation teachers. She thinks that modern evangelicalism is so thin and empty, and she thinks that modern liberal Christianity is simply sold out on some of the major things. She wants to get back to the great classical reformers, particularly Calvin.
Yes, she champions.
Yeah, oh yes, she's a great champion of Calvin, but also Tyndale and all those others. She points out, in fact, that they were wonderfully scholarly people, that the caricature of them as sort of narrow-minded Puritans is a lot of nonsense. They had a very rich appreciation of life in all its aspects. It's very salutary for an Anglican like me, who's slightly distanced myself from Calvin, to be brought up against this by Marilyn Robinson, whom I hugely respect, and showing me things that I shouldn't have neglected over the years. So Marilyn Robinson is a very important example of a novelist writing from a very distinctly Reformed Christian point of view. And I'm sure there are others. They just haven't come across to me. There may be some out there now.
Can we learn as much from the atheists writing about their views on religion?
No, I don't think so. No, because an atheist won't, on the whole, have a very strong alternative vision to put forward. It will either be bleakness, like the Beckett, or Stevie Smith, in the end, a kind of despair. She ends up one of her poems towards the end of her life, having not having rejected the Christian faith, what if we don't teach people to be good without enchantment, she said, we shall all kill one another, we shall all kill one another. It's a very, very powerful passage, and whereas the enchantments which can grip people, which can give them something more than a bare bones morality, something which actually really grips people's imagination and whole life.
Didn't she describe herself as a lapsed atheist?
I don't think that was Stevie Smith. I don't think she was. I think she's very difficult to describe because she was still, to the end of her days, she was so attracted by the Christian faith. And part of her wanted it. Part of her half believed it, but she couldn't finally going on with it. No, I think we learn more from Christian writers because they are putting forward a vision of human existence. Whether people go along with it or not, at least there is something there for actually people to wrestle with. And that's what's interesting about Philip Pullman, of course. He recognizes this. He recognizes that if we don't teach people to good with enchantment, there's something. What he tries to do in his trilogy and his latest book, actually, to give people a kind of enchantment of human existence, but a non-religious one. He recognizes the challenge.
But for people like him, and that he can accept Jesus the man.
And
a lot of people who are not Christians have said to me that they would become Christian if it wasn't for all of the hocus pocus, as they call it, the miracles that they can't quite believe in. Is that a barrier?
Well, I think we just have to show that Jesus can't be accounted for in terms of biography and history. As a straightforward man, he's making some very different challenge to people. The kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is here in his person, in his message, in his teaching, in his miracles. He can't simply be put in the category of a man. There's something very different about him. For me, it's always been the sort of full-blooded Christian faith which has gripped me, which has held me. The idea that in Jesus we have the glory of God revealed in human terms, in humility through the death and through the resurrection. So I don't myself see any kind of attraction simply on a focus on Jesus. I mean, obviously we can admire certain bits of his teaching, and people do. Gandhi did, and all sorts of other people. And of course there is some wonderful teaching in it, but there's also some very hugely enormous claims being made there, and extraordinary things happening around him and through him. So.
Thank you. Just one last question. I don't know how we're doing for time.
What's the time?
It's 11:30, so we better.
Well, just start winding up if that's all right with you.
Yeah, I mean Dostoevsky is a magnificent example of this, and Rowan Williams has written
a great book on absolutely.
Yes. I mean, one of his quotes was that even if someone were to prove to me that the truth lay outside Christ, I should choose to remain with Christ rather than the truth.
That's right. Well, Rowan brings out that by that he didn't mean the kind of intellectual truth. He's not saying, if you believe it's totally intellectual false, you should discount that. I think what Rowan is saying is that even if the way of Christ proves inimical to what the world counts as success, he would want to follow Christ. Even if it led nowhere, got nowhere. I think that's what Rowan says about that particular quote. But it's certainly it is a very powerful quote. And Dostoevsky was indeed a person who was haunted by Jesus. Jesus was absolutely at the center of approach to his understanding of Christianity, which comes across in all his great novels, Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Dostoevsky.
So what you're hoping is that people will read literature through a new perspective for Christian readers. I'm talking about.
Christian readers, I hope this will increase their sense of excitement about the Christian faith. I think that's when they see, how wonderful it is when it's depicted in this kind of form. And secular readers, I hope, as I say, that it will not only prize open their minds, but it will open up their imagination to the glory.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Have you got what you wanted, do you think, Colin?
Indeed, yes. Thank you.